So this brings on, actually, before I move on, I noticed Pierre sent us a link in the comments to a story on El País, which is one of the main papers in Spain. And it said, comarcas, well, I don't know what they are, in the northeastern region will be under perimetral lockdown. I don't know if this has been through Google Translate. No, it hasn't. I don't know what perimetral is.
Lockdown?
Yeah, perimetral. Lockdown from Friday, meaning no one can enter or leave without justified reason. The first paragraph says, Catalan regional government announced on Wednesday new restrictions on mobility to contain blah, 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 because of Easter. So it's Jesus' fault. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We almost did this one in the studio. Producer Pierre wanted to do it in the studio. But the pubs aren't open till next week, so I put the kibosh on it. But we'll definitely do it next week because I've arranged to meet up with some other mates in town next week anyway, so I'm coming in no matter what. So this could be the last home one. It remains to be seen whether they'll let us into the building or whether we'll have to wear 400 masks just to be allowed in.
It seems odd that you wouldn't be allowed into a building, but you're allowed to go into shops and other stuff. So,
in fact, let's hold that because we're going to come to this in our first segment. But you're going to need a bit of help this week, Ian, aren't you? Because you've been doing fuck all.
I've been off, yeah. I haven't been travelling, obviously, because you can't do that anymore. No, it's banned.
That's another thing you can't do.
I've been travelling to Leighton Buzzard and exotic locations like that.
I'm telling. That's not in your bubble.
No, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to go out your zone at the moment.
Well,
you're just not allowed to go into people's homes. So you have to wander around the canal sides and stuff like that.
Is that what happened? So you went and saw a mate in Leighton Buzzard and just sort of.
I picked the wrong day for it weather-wise, so I was freezing by the end of the day. But we did have quite a good laugh, just having a few beers and sat in his garden mainly.
Reminds me of some of the times when we were coming into the studio, like late autumn, and the pubs were closed, but we still came in, and then we just grabbed some tins or whatever, and walked along the south bank.
Yeah, we did that sort of thing.
That got quite nippy at times, didn't it?
It did, yeah. But it's better than nothing.
It's better than nothing, and just popping onto the bank of the Thames when you've had a few too many. Yeah, that's all good stuff, isn't it? So you're going to need a bit of catching up, but I gather you've been doing some work today, so
a little bit.
Draw on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we going to chat about? I think at the end of last week we were speculating about it, and then after the pod, I wrote a story confirming that despite all the pullouts, MWC is still going on, and then we had another bit of MWC related news this week. So I think we'll have a little chat about that. The news itself isn't necessarily earth-shattering, but we can, it's still very topical for our industry, whether or not it's going to happen, whether or not anyone will turn up, all that sort of thing. So we'll start with MWC. Then we go on to your thing. You've been writing about OpenRAN and specifically how into it or not Huawei is that right?
Yeah, I chatted. I was on a call with Victor Zhang, who's the vice president in the UK, and he just commented on it. But I thought it was interesting, sort of trying to read between the lines a little bit and see what's really going on there. Cool.
And then we're going to finish off a couple of stories I wrote that didn't necessarily get tons of reads, but I thought were interesting. So up yours, audience. That were to do with regulation. There's been some interesting sort of legal mulling going on in the States regarding social media, Section 230, that sort of thing. And the UK has just set up a new agency that's designed to keep an eye on US big tech. So basically, it's regulation with a view on American big tech and all that. So that's what we'll finish up on. And just to remind you that if you're watching this on the site, you can also see it on Facebook and YouTube, and you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. Okay, so MWC, let me just remind myself, I have been sort of organised. I've got a couple of windows open. The more minor news at the end of last week, which I haven't got open, so that's why I'm umming and ahhing. I just said GSMA holds firm over MWC 21 despite further cancellation. So we'd had a little chat. I think Light Reading had mentioned that.
I think we did a survey, although I've not seen the results.
Yeah, Yeah, well, I think Phil's been asking people whether they can be bothered.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll fire that up as well.
I haven't seen the results of that. We were asking vendors, specifically Mike Dano and I, whether they were going, and obviously that led to a lot of the news about people withdrawing. But in terms of just attendees themselves commenting on whether they're going, we did do a survey, as you know, as you're investigating now. But I don't know what the upshot of it all was, what people were saying.
I can't see it.
I mean, the impression I get looking on Twitter and other people writing about it and commenting is that there doesn't seem to be much optimism that very many people are going to go at all. And yet the GSMA is obviously pressing on with it, and they, we're going to talk about this, but they have this announcement with the Spanish government this week. You just sort of wonder.
I can't find Phil's thing. I don't think it's coming up on your news. Perhaps you filed it somewhere else.
Maybe. But it just seems like it's in danger of happening, but being really, really sort of empty halls and not much going on at all, really, which would be a bit sad. That's right.
Look, so we'll get to that. We'll talk about the other bit of news, which is basically Spain right now has got some fairly draconian anti-COVID stuff going on. I mean, my feeling, by the way, it's just that everyone's just completely winging it. You're just getting these arbitrary rules. Like, yeah, you can go to the pub, but only if you're hopping and you've got a traffic cone on your head. Or they're just making shit up as they go along. And in Spain, they want everyone to wear masks all the time. I think one of the things that annoys me the most is the attitude to how transmissible this bug is outside.
Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, lesson on that is Slovakia has one of the worst cases and worst fatality rates in the world, and everybody's infected, and you have to wear a mask outside.
Right. Talk about shutting the
I mean, that doesn't prove one thing, but it's it's transmitted
manifestation
inside.
Of futility.
Yeah, because
it's a respiratory illness. It's from one person's gob to another person's gob through breathing and sneezing and coughing and shouting. But it's basically gob to gob, and when you're outside, whatever cloud of vapor, viruses, condensation, whatever comes out your gob dissipates incredibly quickly. Even if there's no breeze, if there's any breeze at all, it's just game over.
Yeah.
And viruses, a lot of people don't realize that viruses exist outside of the human body conditions for a very short amount of time.
Yeah.
Have you noticed how people aren't banging on so much about like hands and stuff anymore?
Well, I think they've realised that. I mean, the UK's been quite. I mean, we complain about the restrictions here, but I think they have been quite sensible on a few things, which is realising that masks being worn outdoors is a silly idea. I think even Valens, who's the chief scientific advisor, said there's no linkage between even big events and COVID spreading outdoors, because everybody was up in arms about people going to the beach, if you remember last summer.
Yeah, that's it.
And it was a super spreader event, and it wasn't. And also they've realised that washing your hands and touching things is just not really. It doesn't spread that way. It spreads me standing next to you at the bar, the pub, having a chat loudly, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why you can't do it anymore, I suppose.
Well, indeed, and why next week, assuming everything goes according to plan, we will still be sitting outside freezing our tits off.
Yeah,
but God damn it,
but not spreading COVID.
But not spreading COVID. Well, we might be catching pneumonia though.
Yeah. That doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, as long as it's not COVID. But while we've seemed to have joined those dots, the Spanish, God bless them, haven't. And they are. So the best man is literally making people wear masks on the beach.
Yeah, even if you're just sunbathing and there's no one around for 50 miles and you're the only man sunbathing.
Yeah, there was some other little weird thing about how you can take it off if you're sitting still, but not if you're moving around or something. So I'm picturing people go in the sea, and then they've got to have a mask which they put on when they climb out the sea until they get to their towel. Anyway,
I'll tell you what, there's going to be
arbitrary.
It's going to be summer temperatures, hot sun. There's going to be some very weird looking tan lines, aren't there?
Well, totally, yes. That will just be odd.
There'll be a laughing stock of Europe.
I thought that was us. I thought we were always a laughing ever since Brexit.
But the Spain are setting themselves up to be the Spanish are setting themselves up to be the new ones. I think.
God knows. I mean, I feel sorry. My family works in tourism in the Canary Islands, and they're coping, but it's just a nightmare for anyone involved in tourism, which is, I think the biggest industry in Spain, apart from
Yeah.
Zara. So yes, but anyway, the Spanish government, they're not letting anyone outside of the EU/Schengen area into Spain at all, unless they've got a really good reason, and that's basically consistent with travel restrictions that have been in place for months now. I don't know if you remember when they're first coming out with it. Really good reason basically means you got some cash. So you can do it for business.
Right.
You can do it if you're Johnny Big Potatoes.
Yeah.
But you can't just go abroad for a laugh.
Sounds about right.
It's got to be about money or diplomacy.
Isn't there some UK rule that you can travel abroad if you've got a big house overseas, but
yeah,
but
exactly.
otherwise
So just a complete.
If you've got a sick relative, tough.
I'm no sort of communist, but this is a complete pro-middle class, anti-working
it's
class.
Outrageous,
rule.
I think. Yeah.
It's just, I remember when they first came out with it, I remember coming to my mates, the Tories aren't even trying to disguise their Toriness now.
No.
They're basically saying you can only travel if you're wearing a pinstripe suit and a bowler hat.
Have a briefcase full of money.
Exactly. And some minions that you abuse constantly. So, but now they've made a special exception. They basically decided anyone who's registered for Mobile World Congress is important enough to come into the country, even if they're not from Europe. So Americans, Chinese, etc., can come, which is on paper a boost for the GSMA, which is still, and fair play to them. They're still sticking with it. They're going, nah, we're doing it, man. We're doing it.
Even if we talk of it being cancelled, it seems
even if we've got to sign all 8 halls over to Danielle Royston, we're going to do it.
So you can turn them into tennis courts or something.
It'd be a mad game of tennis where you're sort of running around chasing the ball. Anyway, so that's a boost for them because without that, it's a Europe only show.
Yeah.
And so those are the bits of news about it, but they sort of set the platform for the more general discussion we can have over sort of whether we personally fancy it and how viable we think it is. I mean, I think as long as Spain keeps being a pain in the arse about masks, that'll certainly put off you and me. I don't think it would put off people from the Far East because they seem to be a bit more into wearing masks. A lot of them, I remember like you traveling to Hong Kong, there's loads of people wearing masks all the time.
Yeah, and also, I don't know, but a lot of the people who come with companies like Huawei and ZTE, I suppose, will just get told they're going, wouldn't they? It's like you're on the plane, it's your job to be there and do this. Whereas we've probably got a bit more
a less enlightened approach to HR over in that part of the world.
Within those specific companies, I am, yeah.
Right.
But I think with us, it's more a case of if we feel comfortable going, we can go, isn't it? And
the
mask
and I both
thing
agree.
Puts me off, but I haven't made my mind up.
Well, I mean, and I guess it varies. If you're a commercial person and you think it'll make a hell of a difference to your job this year, to your remuneration, to whatever, that you turn up and do some selling there, then that's one incentive. You and I, we normally go because it is our job, but this year we haven't had any pressure from anyone further up the food chain to go. So it'd probably be more us having to sell it to them, wouldn't it, rather than the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, I got asked by my boss whether I wanted to go last week or the week before, but it was a sort of polite, we'd like you to go if you can, but obviously don't feel you have to kind of inquiry. And I just said I don't really know at the moment. I mean, I think nobody really knows because things are changing all the time. June's still quite a long way off, and we don't really know where. I mean, Spain might even change its rules. They might, if they end up with a fourth wave or whatever, they might end up saying we're going back on this rule that we had. We've seen this happen in the UK where they said everybody can spend Christmas together, and then 2 days before Christmas they changed their minds. It's happening in Europe as well. So who knows? But
they're all just winging it. No one's got a clue. I mean, the data, if you look at the graphs for last summer, infections just fell off a cliff over the summer across all of Europe.
Yeah, because everybody's outdoors.
Yeah, and we didn't have vaccines. Everyone's outdoors. The weather's nice. I mean, I was looking at some other data, like Africa has barely been touched. Africa, the continent you can normally count on for a plague or two, has just not been touched. So this is obviously, ambient air temperature obviously plays a part. there's been discussion about vitamin D and that sort of thing, and obviously direct sunlight, your body manufactures vitamin D, and that's been one reason they've been noticing some racial discrepancies in who gets it, and it could be that people with darker skin who live in colder climates have more of a vitamin D deficiency because they're basically, by virtue of their skin tone, deflecting more sunlight. So it could be that, but obviously dark-skinned people in Africa are fine. But then having said that, Latin America's having a nightmare.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
So maybe it's not even as simple as latitude. Maybe, God knows. It's really impossible to say. But
I think that the big problem they've got in Europe as well is obviously the pace of the vaccine rollout. And I'm a bit behind on what's going on in Spain, but in France, it's a bit of a disaster there, really, that levels of willingness to take it are so low because you just don't really see them ever getting over it if people aren't, unless you get a substantial
such
amount
irresponsible
of
public briefing on the matter.
Well, that's not helped, has it? Yeah, no, that's obviously made.
We've had another surge
worse,
of even the UK are bottling it a bit over this AstraZeneca thing. But from what I gather, the data in terms of the incidence of blood clots per million people is still tiny. And not really
it's 30 out of 18 million vaccines, 30 people have blood clots.
Yeah, and that's about normal to just people getting blood clots just fucking sitting around.
There's a loss of perspective. It's not surprising because there's been a huge loss of perspective with COVID anyway. So it's quite natural that you would get a loss of perspective now.
Kicked in.
Yeah, I mean, women have been taking the contraceptive pill, which has got all sorts of negative effects, actually, increased risk of cancer and all sorts of things. And how many women take the pill, or how many people take aspirin, which can have negative side effects? And then mild, they're mild medications that you could avoid taking if you wanted. The aspirin you could avoid taking and make do with, just put up with a headache or whatever you've got. But people take it. This is something that stops certain groups from being at risk of something that's quite serious. If you're an older person or got a vulnerable,
it's just because this one's in the media
situation. But it's the whole thing.
I've got the impression that throughout this, sorry, this is a bit of a non-telecoms tangent, but not much has happened this week, to be honest. So I'm not inclined. I'm inclined to indulge these tangents.
We're talking about MWC, so we can justify it, I think.
My impression throughout this whole pandemic has been that nearly all government policy in nearly all countries has been made in response to media, both established and social. Yeah. And whatever's causing the biggest fuss, politicians are just reacting. They've just got this almost Pavlovian relationship with the media. And whatever's causing the biggest fuss at a given moment, they go, fuck it, we better deal with that.
Yeah. Totally.
And so that's why stories about blood clots, which I bet a good proportion of these stories about blood clots are being fed by European governments to their media. There was everyone knew there was a certain time where one of the biggest German papers ran with some complete bollocks, some totally falsifiable bollocks that everyone figured had been fed to them by the German government. And I bet the same goes in France because Macron's properly butthurt about how much better we're doing in France at the moment. So yes, and the reason we got onto that is you were talking about the disinclination a lot of people have in places like France to take it at all.
It's disinclination. It's not just so Spain. It's I don't know what levels of willingness to take it are like in Spain. To be honest, I've no idea. But it's still quite a low number of people that have had it. This is the thing because of the sort of cock up on ordering vaccines in the first place.
Yeah,
they're way behind throughout Europe, and I think they're doing a bit better than they were. But it's still looking like a lot of Spaniards aren't going to have been vaccinated by June.
Yeah,
and I just wonder whether that makes the government worry a little bit about letting people in from all over the place.
Well, there's the other weird thing. So we're getting all this mixed messaging on how even if you're vaccinated, you've got to walk around with your head in a carrier bag or something.
Yeah.
And I know you and I completely agree on this. If you've been vaccinated, then what have you got to worry about?
Yeah.
You could go into a room riddled with coronavirus. You've been fucking vaccinated. You should be all right.
Exactly.
And if you're not, then what's going on?
Yeah. So well, this is the issue with vaccine passports, isn't it? Which to me, I don't really understand what problem they're trying to solve because either you introduce them when you haven't offered it to everybody, in which case it's discriminatory, or you introduce them when you have offered it to everybody, in which case the only people at risk are the ones who choose to put themselves at risk.
Well, but I think you've nailed it. That's the purpose of it. It's an indirect way of forcing you to have a vaccine.
But in a country like the UK, it doesn't make any difference because it's such a low number. It's only about 20% of people here that don't want to have it. It's not enough to really be a big problem.
I know, but they've just got to be in their bonnet about zero COVID now.
Well, it seems that way. They keep saying that they're not going for zero COVID in the UK, don't they? Johnson and Whitty have both commented on that. And
you've been telling me that politicians sometimes don't tell the entire truth, Nick.
Well, yeah. This is off topic now. But,
yes, it is. Well, so back to World Congress. Our feeling, well, my feeling, but I suspect yours as well, is that with every level of COVID-related hassle, even if we can get into the country, and you've got to have had your test 72 hours beforehand and all that stuff, which means you've got to have another test while you're there. If you're there, if your 72 hours runs out, which is bound to.
Yeah.
So you've got to have the test. You've got to jump through all these hoops. Then you've got to wear a mask the whole time. There's not going to be that many people there, so the sort of evening stuff isn't going to be as much fun as it was before. Yeah. A lot of the people you'd normally see, like Ericsson and Nokia and Microsoft and Intel and Google and so on, aren't going to be there.
Well, this is the other thing. On the you just mentioned the evening stuff. What's the situation with things even being open in Spain? I mean, are they like us and they're going in for an outdoors thing? Because if you've only got a few places that have outdoor seating, then it's going to be quite difficult to get.
When I was in the Canaries this Christmas, I went over to Santa Cruz, which is one of the biggest. It's like a small city in the Canaries. And me and my brother went out for a drink, and it was like hard stop at 10. Yeah. This is Spain, man. Normally you start sort of getting ready at 10. So that kind of arses everything up. I mean, some of the best times I've had certainly have been like really late nights in Barcelona. It's bailing at 10.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what the situation is in Barcelona on bars and restaurants being allowed to open indoors and stuff. And if they can't, then you're going to have problems just finding places to go. So I didn't even consider that outdoors. Now,
it's June, like that plaza where Glaciares, where we go and have that Wednesday night piss up.
Yeah,
that's your classic Spanish plaza, which has got loads of outdoor furniture and obviously you can just mill around. But you still got to go indoors. Well, I suppose that they could do table service or whatever. I mean, the logistics of it are tight. God, I remember. I don't know if I've ever said this on the pod. But, when we were in Santa Cruz at Christmas, we went. Me and my brother and my mum. We went to eat somewhere, and there was just one woman there who was really officious about the Rona, like just walking around with this sort of pump action alcohol gel thing. And banging on about masks and all that sort of thing. And we sort of put up with it for a bit. And then she kept nagging us and we just got the arsehole and just started going, nah, we're not doing it. And she went, oh, you got to. She went, well, we're not. So now what? And I ordered some seafood. I got these prawns. And I ate the prawns, but they were like shell on. So I got like the torso and head that you have with prawns. And I got some salad leaves. And I tied them around the head of the prawns. And then when she came back, I went, look, now even the fucking prawns have got masks on. After that, she got someone else to wait on us. So you could argue that was a bit antisocial of me. But I bring it up, not just because I think it's funny, but because it's an illustration of just the tension that everything creates. I heard that in the UK, there's going to be some imperative on the bar staff to be constantly sort of asking you this, that, and the other about whether you've been tested or I don't know what it is, but it just creates aggro, doesn't it? And then
it creates aggro, and it puts. I mean, this is the problem that the GSMA is faced with. I think is that they've had to introduce all these rigorous health and safety restrictions and have temperature control points inside the hangars and. One-way systems and those people are pretty officious anyway. The young students they get to check the badges, they're a bit overly officious, I find. So just imagine what it's going to be like, and they've had to do that to reassure the government, obviously, and allow it to try and proceed. And probably a lot of attendees are thinking, "Oh, I'm not going to go unless it is really safe." But other ones will just think, "Do I want to put up with the hassle? Do I want to go and spend 3 days where there might not be that many people there? I've got to wear a face mask all the time in 30-degree temperatures. I might not be able to get into bars and restaurants if they're closed, and and then I've got to have a temperature. I've got to have a test every 72 hours. I've got to pay money to get that done before I travel."
So just increasingly, you just start thinking, do you know what? I mean,
those are the thoughts going through my mind, and so I'm thinking, well, other people are must be thinking the same thing. Do we really want to bother with this, or do we just do it virtually? And we got, we've managed to, and this is the other worry, that people managed last year quite well, didn't they? Even though it didn't happen, it wasn't like Ericsson had a bad year because Mobile World Congress didn't happen.
So this brings on, actually, before I move on, I noticed Pierre sent us a link in the comments to a story on El País, which is one of the main papers in Spain. And it said, comarcas, well, I don't know what they are, in the northeastern region will be under perimetral lockdown. I don't know if this has been through Google Translate. No, it hasn't. I don't know what perimetral is.
Lockdown?
Yeah, perimetral. Lockdown from Friday, meaning no one can enter or leave without justified reason. The first paragraph says, Catalan regional government announced on Wednesday new restrictions on mobility to contain blah, 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 because of Easter. So it's Jesus' fault. From Friday, the region's comarcas, which are traditional administrative areas in parts of Spain, will be placed under a perimetral lockdown, meaning no one is allowed to enter or leave without a justified reason, such as to go to work or visit a doctor. So basically, they're having regional lockdowns in Spain. Yeah. So, I mean, that doesn't really affect Mobile World Congress because that just means going from Catalonia to Madrid or whatever, from Barcelona to Madrid or something, I would imagine.
But we don't know what's going to happen.
But that's just yet another bit of aggro. I mean, I think that just goes into the mix. But before I move on from the Mobile World Congress thing, I was chatting to another person at Informa who works on the event side. I was telling them about all this, and they speculated that, I don't know this, so I'm not gonna assert anything. But I think, did you chat to Ericsson a while back and get the impression they're not getting any refund? Is that, if I remember that right?
I don't think if you pull out, I don't think you get a refund. No one's getting refunds.
No one's getting refunds. Unless they cancel.
Unless they cancel. I think if they cancel, they would have to do it. I'd have to look at. I mean, I know they're not getting refunds because the GSMA's already said that this year that they wouldn't get refunds.
They're not getting shit, even though they incentivized them to rebook last year. So,
the thing is, they didn't get a cash refund this time because what they did is they rebooked, didn't they? And they got they got this staggered system where you get some kind of a discount if you commit to doing it for 3 years. But there was no cash. There was no cash like reimbursement anyway.
There was an offer. I seem to remember last year.
Took that. I don't think anybody would have taken that because people at the time would have thought it's a big show, it's important, we want to go there. Pretty much everybody would have rebooked. Maybe some smaller vendors didn't, but Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, the big guys, Intel, all those guys will have rebooked.
But if they've rebooked and now they've pulled out this year, then they've lost.
They've just lost that credit and what they've
lost
paid.
That credit. Yeah, I suppose so. So it's not that they've lost 2 years worth of stuff. And I stress when I'm talking about this stuff, I do sympathise with GSMA. They're in a position, they're no happier about this than anyone else. It's not like they're trying to rip people off. But
I don't know if they cancelled, whether that's the question. I don't know if they cancelled this year. Would they? Well,
that's what I'm leading up to because that's what makes me think they might just run the event even if there's no one there.
Yeah, and also if they cancel, do they make money actually at the event? It's the booking, surely, and the exhibitions the space that they sell before that makes the money. It's not really, if attendees don't go, this is the other thing, because attendees pay quite a lot of money unless they're journalists like us or other people who can get away with free passes.
Freeloaders like us.
Then they pay quite a lot to go. So if you say we're cancelling, do you have to reimburse the costs for? I'd be really interested. This would be a really interesting thing, is to know how many people have paid for tickets this year.
Yes, indeed.
I mean, we should. They won't tell us, but we should ask how many people have actually paid for tickets. What this 40,000 to 50,000 visitors projection? Maybe it's based on.
And it's not cheap, is it? Unless you're a hack.
It's not cheap. So you're if you're not getting the money back, and you're just writing that off, and maybe that'll make some people want to go. I don't know, that they'd rather not lose the money. And
so,
but if there's no one there, if there's no exhibitors there, then you.
But the long and short of it is, it seems likely to be in the GSMA's interest to run the event, even if no one turns up.
I mean, I think after this week and the announcement with the Spanish government, most of the big exhibitors that that are not Chinese have pulled out now. To be honest with you, haven't they?
Yeah. So if they haven't cancelled it yet,
and if they haven't
what
cancelled
could
it
happen?
now, I mean, unless the service providers seem quite committed, and they are the GSMA, aren't they? Really, the Oranges and the Deutsche Telecoms of this world.
Yeah.
And Telefonica still seem to be saying we're going to have some kind of presence at the show, even if it's scaled down massively. Whereas last year they were umming and ahhing, and then eventually went, well, we're not going to go actually, and then it got cancelled.
Yes.
When they
when it goes without saying, it'd be absurd for the GSMA to let the thing run when its own members aren't turning up.
So I just have I think it will go ahead and just risk being very, very empty, a bit of a ghost town. And then does it do damage then, I suppose, that I don't know if you use the word reputational damage, but it doesn't look very good, does it, for them to put on a big event and you've only got a few thousand people.
Especially if we turn up with Pierre and film emptiness.
And then meanwhile, you've got the virtual one happening in parallel and potentially serving its purpose and doing. This is the sort of thing that makes me worry a little bit about the longevity, I suppose, of it as a physical event.
Well, that's that's the flip side to me. While I can understand that they might want to run it anyway, so that they're not really sort of catastrophically out of pocket. The flip side is they do risk sort of alienating the likes of Ericsson and Nokia a bit more, by not giving them anything back. It might be in the deal, and I certainly haven't heard any of them publicly moan about it. Yeah. But behind the scenes, Boyer and what's his name, Pekka, might be thinking, Jesus Christ, you could have chucked us 50% back or something like that.
Yeah.
So that might make them a bit less inclined to bother. Anyway, but they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I wouldn't want to be in their position.
It's not insignificant money, is it? Based on what Danielle Royston publicly said about how much she'd pay. She said millions. That's a lot of money. You think about what these companies report in net profit, and they're big. Obviously, they're multi-billion dollars sales.
Yeah,
but
still,
once you start taking things like that off, it is starting to have some kind of impact. And your marketing budget is.
Tell you what, I've got a tangent there. I saw a little press release from Nokia just where they've had their AGM, just their board meeting, and they're paying no dividend again this year. But I think that was expected. That what they were teasing was maybe a dividend for the 21 financial year.
Yeah.
But then they have to publish what all the non-exec directors get, and the chairwoman, who's a Nokia lifer incidentally, gets almost $500,000. Just for, I don't know what these do. I'm sure they do something, but she gets $500,000. The other board members get a quarter of that.
Well,
you're basically looking at about a couple of mil of outlay just for these AGMs, which just seem to exist to rubber stamp what the execs say. Like I said, I'm sure they do more. I've never been there, but it's all very opaque. And if I don't know what they do, they're partly at fault for not making it clearer. I just feel on the part of investors, and I've still got a tenner in Nokia, which is like £8 or something now. So as an investor, I'm not happy that I'm not getting a dividend of 4p, and all these board members are getting millions of shekels or whatever they pay them. No, they're euros in Finland, aren't they? So yes, okay. Look, we'd better move it on. We managed to get longer out of that segment than I thought we would.
Wittering on about coronavirus always does.
Well, yes, having some many self-indulgent tangents, and it won't be the last either. No. Okay, so why don't you tell us? I won't trail it. Why don't you tell us what you've been writing about today?
I mean, it's going back a week or so when Huawei reported their annual results. There was very little mention of or talk of anything to do with OpenRAN. Quite in contrast to Nokia, who made a really, really big deal of it. So I thought I'd ask, the Vice President Victor Zhang, I think he's based in the UK, when he did his little Q&A with reporters, what their position is on it at the moment. And publicly, it's not really changed. I mean, a couple of years ago, they were saying they didn't really, they weren't supporting it and weren't really active there. And his words last week were basically, we don't see it doing anything. There's no commercial opportunities in the next 2 or 3 years. There's a long way to go, without saying we're not involved at all. That was basically the message.
A similar sort of noise to Ericsson, which is like, yeah, great.
Well, Ericsson has a pathway, and they have
Okay.
mentioned it in press releases, and they've also, I don't know if you remember, quite recently opened this lab in Canada.
Yeah, and I headline that as them tiptoeing towards OpenRAN.
Yeah, and they've had a couple of other things as well.
It's just always seemed a bit reluctant, that's all.
Well, it's interesting looking at the three of them and their attitudes towards OpenRAN, because the very biggest one, which is obviously if you're the biggest, you're arguably the most threatened by OpenRAN, and particularly in the case of Huawei, because I think a lot of governments and service providers have talked up OpenRAN as a way to replace Huawei, haven't they? So
yeah, because the US politicians are quite hard.
So from that perspective, you could sort of understand why it's more skeptical about OpenRAN. Then you've got Ericsson, which is the one in the middle, I would say. It's a bigger 5G player than Nokia, which is sort of we're not really sure. They're kind of tentative about it and trying to show willing, but have got some concerns, it seems. And then you've got the smallest one, which obviously sees, it's had some bad publicity with its 5G products and not done so well early on there, and it's got all sorts of challenges. And they obviously think OpenRAN could be an opportunity. They're kind of seeing
sort of strategic opportunity to get ahead
so
of
I
the
find
game
that the different positions
emerging technology
quite interesting. But I don't believe that Huawei hasn't got anything to do with OpenRAN at all, and that it's just completely avoiding it. And I'm pretty sure that there are people within Huawei, with its $20 billion that it spends a year on R&D, who are looking at OpenRAN and thinking, what does this mean for us in the future? And because the thing is, if you're going to cut yourself out of it completely and just say, oh, sorry, we don't want anything to do with it, not interested, and the whole market lurches that way in a few years' time, and we don't know what's going to happen, but it might be that in the late 2020s, everybody wants to buy products that are based on those specifications. If you've sort of stubbornly resisted doing anything in a kind of Kodak-like way, then you're going to be in trouble, aren't you?
Yeah, I definitely got the impression, certainly from Ericsson, for example, that their strategy was, we're not happy about it, but we can't afford to just bury our head in the sand.
Yeah,
and also they've got a delicate messaging balance to strike with their customers. Because if they get to their customers, now we're not doing it, you got to buy our stuff or nothing, then A, their customers might go, well, then nothing.
Yeah.
And B, it makes it sound like they're not that interested in their customers demands. Having the best possible RAN.
Yeah.
So they've always had a delicate balancing out, and I've chosen between the lines. And obviously, if we had an Ericsson exec on this, he'd be going, no, we're really into it. And that's my Swedish
exactly
accent.
Like that.
Sorry,
that's pretty good.
I didn't know Boyer lives in the States. I didn't realise that until I read.
I think he moves backwards and forwards between the States.
He did a big Wall Street Journal job where it's like one of those proper WSJ deep dives.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's man of the world, international man of mystery. He just comes back home to get some more furniture every now and then. Because they haven't got an IKEA where he lives in the States. And so they've got to strike that messaging balance. But with each new announcement, as you say, that lab was a good example. You get the impression that they're going to go, well, let's make a virtue out of necessity.
Yeah.
If we're going to have to go through all this effort to show that we're into it, we might as well get into it.
Yeah.
And let's be really good at both, but have our fingers crossed behind our back that people go, hold on a sec, we'll just stick with some closed integrated system because it just works. It's like Apple versus Android, isn't it? Or Apple versus Windows. The old way is that the integrated walled garden way, which they obviously want you to keep doing because then you buy all their stuff and their service contracts and there's stickiness. It's very hard to move away from them. But they've certainly got to be seen to be embracing this more sort of, I don't know, heterogeneous sort of approach.
I think one of the questions for me is really whether service providers actually want OpenRAN, or do they want an alternative to the big three vendors?
Yeah.
Because that's the risk for someone like Nokia, where it says, oh, we've got a really good opportunity to grow market share here and to go into networks that we're not in using OpenRAN products. Well, yeah, if they want, if OpenRAN in itself is the key thing for these decision makers, then that's great. But if your Deutsche Telekom buyer has been told the reason we're backing OpenRAN is because we want vendor diversity and we don't want to be reliant on Nokia and Ericsson, we need to bring new players into the mix, then it's quite a dangerous transition for those companies, isn't it?
Oh, because totally. There's no doubt.
And that's the risky thing. And they keep talking up. Nokia's interesting because they keep talking up this reference point with Deutsche Telekom specifically, where they got kicked off Deutsche Telekom's German network a few years ago for basically just not being good enough, and they brought Ericsson in instead. And they've obviously been looking for a way back in. And there's some positive comments by Claudia Nemat, who I think sort of head of tech and innovation, about how Nokia's really adapting well, and they're an important OpenRAN partner for us. So they're obviously hoping for this, for an opportunity to come into Deutsche Telekom's German network as an OpenRAN supplier and have that as a kind of flagship customer announcement that they can make. But if they don't get something like that, and at the moment, all I'm aware of them doing in OpenRAN at the moment is this one deal in Japan with Rakuten, where they provide some of the 4G radio units. But it's not, you wouldn't make a fuss about you being the 4G radio unit supplier to Rakuten's network. And, maybe if they can get loads and loads of deals like that with lots of operators they've never had anything to do with before, it's good business for them. But, I just wonder whether it could all go wrong because operators are just determined to use the Mavenirs and the Altiostars of this world and not go and rely on the people that they've always used. And, that's the big question for me, I think.
I'm instinctively a pro-free market person. But what often happens, people who aren't sort of throw that back in your face and they go, oh, what about this? What about that? And of course, a perfect market rarely exists. That's why we have to, and we'll come to this in our next segment, that's why we have to have regulators, because companies, if they get half a chance, will corrupt the market in their favour. But in an ideal pure market, you have a marketplace of Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei and Altiostar and Mavenir and so on, and you'll just cherry pick, won't you?
Yeah,
you'll have some kind of price comparison site, like compare the RAN.
Yeah,
and you'll be able to have but this baseband gets 9 out of 10, whereas this bit of software gets 5 out of 10, and so on.
This is the other question though, is whether that setup's sustainable. Really, I mean, we've seen RAN consolidation going on for years, and we've got these 3 big companies, and what's to stop the same thing from happening again with, I'm not convinced we're going to have a market where there's 20 or 30 different suppliers selling globally. No,
there's bound to be consolidation.
There'll be some players that survive and some that don't and get swallowed up. And then do we move towards something that's more integrated anyway? Does it go back to being, I mean, it's interesting. I was on a call earlier actually with, I can't name the companies because it's under an embargo till Tuesday.
Okay.
But it's a tie-up. It's an OpenRAN tie-up. So it's almost counterintuitive, because it's a software company and a hardware company.
I've got an embargo thing.
You'll know who it is.
Yeah.
And so the key question is, how OpenRAN is this really? Because it's, it's almost going against what OpenRAN's supposed to be about, that you have a hardware company and software company getting together and being an Ericsson or a Nokia. It's just the different companies teaming up. But can you guarantee that you could just take the hardware and run it with somebody else's software? I mean, they're saying they can guarantee that.
Yeah, and let's say we had this free market, and it turns out that the companies you're referring to end up being the best at their particular niche. A couple of other companies end up being the best at their niche, and there's a sort of general acceptance that if you combine companies A, B, C, and D, you've got a dog's bollocks RAN.
Yeah.
Then obviously that makes it a clear M&A opportunity for someone like, I don't know, Microsoft or whatever, some deep-pocketed American tech company, let's say, just buy all 4 of them.
Exactly.
And just go,
and then it's integrated again, isn't it? So
pretty much, yeah.
How do you always guarantee? I mean, I suspect one thing that's going to happen, I think, and Howard Watson at BT, he's like the CTIO of BT, he said this. He said, just because we have lots of different RAN vendors in an OpenRAN future doesn't mean we're going to be using 6 or 7 different suppliers. We'll probably still use 2 or 3 because it just gets too complicated otherwise. But you have options, and you have, I guess, the freedom to, it's easier maybe if you're unhappy with one of them to then do a kind of swap sort of thing, or bring somebody else in a certain area perhaps. But the fact is that they're probably not going to be moving away from this model of using one or two big vendors anyway, because it just wouldn't work. You probably wouldn't get the commercial arrangements. You'd have too much complexity in terms of different products to support. And that's why this sort of systems integration stuff always gets brought to the fore, I think, with chats about OpenRAN, how important that is and what an operational nightmare it could be trying to do things that way. I mean, the Rakuten network sounds like a real complicated mess to manage. I mean, they'll insist it's not, but there's so many different companies involved in that, it seems to me.
So, and the whole vision is supposed to be, because everything's virtualized and softwareized,
that's easy.
It's not a mess to manage, but there's still incredible complexity there.
You've just got relationships to manage with different companies, haven't you? If something goes wrong, you've got several. It's like buying a triple play or a quad play deal as a telecom customer, or going out and getting broadband from BT, a Sky TV package, your mobiles from Three. You've got three companies to deal with instead of just one that you can phone up every now and again, or that phones you about.
And the remote control can never quite get its head around it all.
Exactly.
Like we've got the more complexity. We've got an LG telly, and by RIP LG in smartphones. By the way, they officially bailed from
I did
smartphones.
See that this week. Yeah, that was one of the big stories.
There's not that much to say about it other than it is what it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, we've got this quite sort of whizzy LG telly that's got a remote. They call a magic remote control that's like motion sensitive, and you sort of control a cursor on the screen.
Yeah,
with the remote control. And I was looking at it because it was acting up. It's not even infrared, it's RF, it's radio frequency. So it's all quite clever, but every now and then the thing just freaks out and stops working. And all this clever interface, like the user interface is a former smartphone operating system called WebOS, which used to be on Palms. It was Palm, and then someone else bought it, and they couldn't. HP bought it. HP's the graveyard of technology. It's basically, you have to go through the HP stage before you finally get put out of your misery. HP or Microsoft.
It's like purgatory, is it, HP?
Yeah, exactly. HP bought it, went, it'd be great, we'll put it in printers. And then they went, nah, all right, LG, you can have it for tuppence halfpenny. And LG got it, and they didn't make the mistake of trying to run phones on it, they just whacked it on their tellies. So you've got this quite smartphone-y interface, and you've got this clever control, and everything's all space age and all that. And then when it doesn't work, you kind of wish you had a boring old sort of straightforward telly. So maybe the extent to which my telly analogy applies to Rakuten's.
Well, this is why there's still a question
network.
mark over OpenRAN and whether it will succeed and work and whether it'll live up to that promise, because I just wonder whether it's, whether it's the best. I mean, Gabriel Brown, I should say, who's an analyst Gabe to his mates, an analyst at Heavy Reading. There was something I missed this week. There was a big sort of light reading event.
He's got some quite cool. I saw a little photo on light reading of him doing a pod with Phil. Gabe's got some full.
He's gone
Mel
for the
Gibson
sort of
kind of hair going on.
He looks a bit like Andrew Lincoln in The Walking Dead.
That's it. Yeah. He's got it swept back and a mullet.
Yeah.
I think he looks like it suits him.
I like it. But anyway, he was to the OpenRAN point. He was one of the big questions he wanted answered, and I don't know if it was answered because I was off this week. But he wanted to ask people whether OpenRAN was the best way to build a network. And that's the big thing that we.
It's the long and short of it, isn't it?
I mean, to come back to Huawei a bit, I think one of the interesting things about them is that they're the only big company that isn't a part of this specifications group, the ORAN Alliance. If you look at the membership list of the ORAN Alliance, so even Ericsson, with all of its skepticism, and it's quite tentative about it, and it's there. It's a fully signed up member. Nokia's been there from the beginning. And the other interesting thing is there's a huge number of Chinese companies involved in the ORAN Alliance. I mean, it's quite an awkward one, I think, for some of these US policymakers who seem to think that OpenRAN is kind of a way of keeping technology out of Chinese hands. That I think it's over 40 of the members. So they're the second most represented country after the US in terms of the number of members. All the big Chinese operators are in it. Right. Mobile, Telecom and Unicom. ZTE is a member. And then you've got dozens of smaller, like not very well-known vendors. So the only big company in China
would be a member just to keep an eye on things.
So this is the weird thing. The only company in China that has anything to do with telecom that's not involved in the ORAN Alliance is Huawei. And I just wonder, it's been suggested to me that maybe some of these smaller vendors are, allegedly proxies for Huawei, that they're kind of representing Huawei, or, that Huawei's sort of privy to what's going on
Could
simply
be.
because it's got this very. I mean, I think it has a much closer relationship with China Mobile, conceivably, than a Western European operator would have with a supplier. Yeah. So
You'd think.
conceivably, yeah. So maybe it's privy to what's going on through that sort of relationship. But it would seem very
It's
odd
odd.
to me
They're
that they
conspicuous
weren't.
by their absence.
Yeah, that they weren't kind of involved to some extent or aware of what's happening. It just wouldn't make sense to me.
I agree.
And the Chinese operators wanted, by that. I think it's the other thing to say is that when we're talking about supplier diversity and wanting alternatives to Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia, China's shown it doesn't really care that much about supplier diversity, and they're quite happy to give 5G contracts out mainly to Huawei. And yet, from talking to people who don't want to be named, the operators are really, really keen on OpenRAN and actually making use of it. And why else would mobile have been behind the technology from the beginning? Actually, China Mobile,
Right.
It's been one of the most active.
I find it hard. Maybe you can shed some light on it. I find it hard to work out what the competitive dynamic is in China at all. I mean, Telecom and Unicom are totally state-owned, aren't they?
I think they're all
right.
kind
so
of state-owned.
Mobile. So they're all state-owned. So, I mean, traditional Western concepts of competition don't really apply here.
No.
But,
which means they're looking to use it for different reasons. You know, we keep talking about OpenRAN as about supply diversity and about getting competition into the market, but there are other reasons. I mean, you talk to Orange actually about OpenRAN, and they talk about it in a Arnaud Van Paris, who's one of the main 5G guys there, talks about it in a completely different way. He just says architecturally it makes more sense for small cells and doing indoor stuff, and you can be more innovative with it because you can make use of things like the radio intelligent controller, and that gives you a chance to do sort of new things on the network side. So they talk about it in a completely different way from supply diversity. And I think that's probably where a lot of the Chinese interest comes from. But then why would Huawei not want to be a part of that? You know, it doesn't make sense, does it, that it wouldn't be involved in that?
Actually, one other thing I want to mention before we move it on. I had a little chat with OpenNet and Amdocs this week. This is apropos nothing.
I'm supposed to be speaking to them next week.
Right, yeah. I just remember, because I remember one of the things I said on the call, you know, I wasn't chasing anything journalistically, and they weren't necessarily trying to promote any like product launch or anything. And I just said, well, you know, it's worth chatting anyway, because you never know, you might make it onto the pod.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd justify that claim. But yeah, they're an interesting one because just to recap, they're both, I mean, OpenNet is traditionally a BSS player, which is like the sort of the billing side of the software that operators use, as opposed to OSS, which is more the plumbing and the generally making everything work. So I suppose you could say OSS is back end and BSS is front end in terms of managing the relationship with the customer. And then they got very into being digital and cloud native and all these digital transformation buzzwords a few years ago, when they went through a bit of a transformation of their own. At the same time, they were in litigation with Amdocs, which then got resolved. I think I haven't got the piece up, but I think it was resolved. You know how when these things get resolved, all the terms are kept very. I think
they were paying OpenNet or something. Yeah,
I think that I got the impression that if there was a winner from the litigation, it was OpenNet.
Yeah,
and then lo and behold, Amdocs goes off and buys them.
Yeah, because I think OpenNet was still winning business at Amdocs' expense for this sort of specific charging stuff that it does. So
we've tried setting the lawyers on them. Let's just buy the fuckers and shut them up that way. Anyway, and they've been a bit quiet. It's been a year or so. They've been a bit quiet. So I got Niall Norton, who was the CEO and still is the CEO of OpenNet, which still, as you'd expect, exists in a sort of semi-autonomous way within Amdocs now. And an Amdocs guy, I think his first name was Avishai. I might have screwed that up.
Right, yeah.
And I can't remember his surname. And yeah, just had a little chat. I think the main reason they wanted to have a chat is just so that it's clear, and this might be the same with you, that things are going all right.
Yeah.
So we've got not only these two companies.
Well, there's always a concern, isn't there, when you get a small, innovative,
they say that. It might
company.
Not be. But they say it's going all right. Yeah, you've got a smaller, more agile company, quite a big company in Amdocs. You've got companies that used to be actively adversarial towards each other now in the same. You'll have some degree of culture difference. One's Irish, the other's Israeli. If
Yeah.
only time zones alone, they're about 4 time zones apart.
Yeah.
I don't want to generalize about either culture, but they're just different cultures.
Well, I find it amusing because of some of the things that Niall said about Amdocs in the past. That was the thing that struck me about the deal. How is he going to live this one down within Amdocs? And I'm supposed to speak to them next week. I just feel like saying on the phone, that you've been pretty disparaging in the past.
I tried slipping in one or two very gentle digs. I just thought it'd be a bit rude to stir the pot too much.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's there. Him actively briefing against them, as he would when he's involved in what seemed like a fairly fraught bit of litigation.
Yeah.
But anyway, and yeah, I mean, their point was, so the chat was, other than everything's going cool, and that basically Amdocs is the very sort of cloud native bit of the OpenNet is a cloud native bit of Amdocs now. That's their sort of strength, and that's obviously what Amdocs admired about them, although it had a funny way of showing it. And then the other thing we chatted about was just 5G. How's it going? Because they were saying, we're all about helping people to monetize 5G, helping them to get the most out of it and do all these novel new things. I was going, well, yeah, you say that, but I'm not getting the impression that anyone's making much money out of 5G so far. Yeah. And they sort of, they weren't about to go, nah, you got a point, actually, Scott. It's all been a bit of a waste of time. But yeah, I think they sort of conceded indirectly that it's been a slow starter.
Yeah.
And I'm just sort of looking at some of my notes. I mean, they were just saying how, the real thing is it's about this confluence of telecoms and IT and ITizing telecoms. And I suppose making it seamless where you've got the computing part. And actually, this isn't how I intended it, but it's going to seem like I'm more professional now. It's quite a good segue into the final segment. And how, that obviously involves putting quite a lot of pieces in place, lots of AI, lots of automation, all that sort of thing. But once the positions are all in place, and obviously OpenNet/Amdocs reckon that they're one of the main people you want to help you with that, then you can really start kicking ass on, I said, is this about network slicing? And they were going, well, that's part of it, but it's just more about just bespoke communication offerings full stop. The network slicing's a part of it, but it's not necessarily as simple as just going, right, I want 66% sort of low latency, high reliability, and then the rest can be the other stuff. It's a bit more nuanced than that. So I just thought I'd make that point ahead, and that's interesting to know that you're going to be chatting to them. The bottom line is that everything's going all right. 5G is going all right. It's taken a bit of a while to get there, but you wait. When it gets its shit together, it'll blow your mind. I'm still not totally convinced. We'll see. But, I mean, it will get there. I'm not totally convinced that 5G will be useful. It will eventually. It's just still not immediately obvious how.
Should be useful around about the time 6G comes along.
Yeah. So anyway, I thought I'd mention that. So there you go. Niall said he listened. So, all right, Niall. I told you I'll give you a shout out. I said to him, we need to go over to Dublin and do one in the pub. So you weren't there for that one, were you?
No, I missed that. Jamie. I was somewhere else. It was back in the days of travel. So
yeah, that was Jamie when we couldn't even get Jamie to sit up straight before we started filming. But next time we're allowed to go over there. Apparently Ireland's dragging its feet a bit more on all the Rona stuff, as per Spain. But we'll see if we can get over there and have another Dublin sesh.
Yeah.
So there we go. All right. So yes, the segue there, talking about the confluence of telecoms and IT, a couple of stories, one of which I just wrote today, which is headlined. God, I thought I got that. I keep saying how I'm being all professional. Every time I think I've got a public... Oh, yeah, that's because the segues to a story which wasn't initially part of it. Oh, yeah. So my story was US export ban metastasizes to Chinese supercomputing companies. So, they've had this entity list for a while.
Yeah.
And it's mainly been applied to Huawei and a few other random sort of Shenzhen players that no one's heard of outside of China. Well, now they've decided that that Chinese companies involved in supercomputing are helping out the Chinese military, so they've got to be banned. And
Okay.
you sort of think, in one way, it's consistent, because what we've got is this gradual, incremental, rather crude and heavy-handed attempt by the US to regain some of the ground they sort of willingly relinquished to China in terms of technology, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of giving them full access to Western markets while the West doesn't necessarily have full access to the Chinese market and all that sort of thing. But on the other hand, there were just some parts of it, and I don't doubt that lots of Chinese companies do help out the Chinese state and thus directly or indirectly the Chinese military. But I'm just not necessarily convinced that that's reason enough to go around sort of banning them to the extent that they just have. And I'll just give you one little quote from the story I wrote today. So this is from US Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo. I took out her middle initial. Americans like to put middle initials in. She was like,
yeah,
Gina
I never put those in. I noticed
Yeah.
some executives also just have an initial. It tends to be Indian ones.
Right.
Indian executives often have an A,
Yeah, it's a bit like cricket
Rawalpindi
scorecards, isn't it? Like
something,
AJP Laxman or something like that.
It's like, just give me your first name, man.
What's the problem? Unless your actual name. I mean, Americans might have a name like TJ or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think she was Gina M. Raimondo, and I just took the M out because I'm not having it. Anyway, this Gina goes, this is her quote: "Supercomputing capabilities are vital for the development of any, perhaps almost all, modern weapons and national security systems, such as nuclear weapons and hypersonic weapons. The Department of Commerce will use the full extent of its authorities," I think she meant authority, but there we go, "to prevent China from leveraging, not using, US technologies to support these destabilizing military modernization efforts." So that quote basically says that any attempt by China to modernize its military is intrinsically destabilizing. And I just sort of thought, but doesn't America always modernize its military? Is that not destabilizing? So then we're just making an absolutely crude judgment call, which is our guns good, your guns bad. And that might even be true. There are growing signs that China under Xi Jinping has some pretty fucking worrying tendencies in terms of its global ambitions. But I just still think, in a pure sense, it's a bit rich. America going, nah, you're out of order wanting to modernize your military. And you're out of order using domestic companies to help your military. I mean, obviously, America's got tons of defense contractors.
So the sanctions that they've imposed on these supercomputing companies prevent
dealings between.
It's on the entity list, so they can't procure technology from American firms, kind of thing.
Yeah, but as we know, that can be a moving target, because then they start getting into intellectual property and stuff like that. And maybe. So does that mean that they're all banned from NVIDIA, which is really strong on supercomputing? So they're banned from anything to do with NVIDIA, whether it's actual hardware or whether it's software or whether it's intellectual property, obviously Intel, all that sort of thing. So in one way, it feels like an extension of the chip thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so they've listed 7 supercomputing, none of which I've ever heard of. They're all Chinese companies with lots of X's in there. They like an X, don't they, in China?
Yeah.
That sounds like a sh, isn't it?
Well, it's the name of the name of the man in charge, isn't it?
Exactly,
so,
Xi.
X's have become more popular since he took over.
Maybe that's it. Everyone wants a curry favor. So yeah, that's one thing there that I think's interesting. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if you agree with me. I just think, on one side, I think it's good that America isn't laying down. China's obviously got some global ambitions, and there has to be a time where lines drawn in the sand. You can't just let them keep going, keep annexing places in Southeast Asia, keep buying up half of Africa, and at some stage you've got to push back. It's distinctly debatable whether they're going about it the right way, but not having read the story and having had a week off, but given how I've characterized it, this growing inclination, and this is under a new regime as well in America, for them to put more and more sectors of the Chinese economy on the entity list. What do you think of it?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I suppose I thought it might be done. Like you say, it's not. it's not done in a very constructive way. But then again, is there a way to do this constructively? I don't know. It's it's been coming for a while. I think this US-China clash, and Donald Trump went about things in a very kind of Trumpian way, and I think people expected things to change a bit under Biden, and he's basically just sort of carried on with the same method, I think, but just attracts less criticism for it because he's not Donald Trump. And I mean, at some point, there's a chance that the US and China go to war, at some point in the next sort of 10, 20 years.
Well,
what kind of war that would be, I don't know. It could be a war fought on, any sort of number of different levels, really, whether it's just a more extreme kind of trade war or whether it's something that involves technology or whether it's a more kind
like
of conventional.
Taiwan's that's where the smart money is,
or it could be a hot war where there's some kind of, proxy war fought somewhere like Taiwan. But that's probably going to happen at some point over the next 10, 20,
But that wouldn't even
years.
Be a proxy war, would it? I mean, I was just chatting to my son about that, who's doing history and politics at A-level. And I was talking about how the latter half of the 20th century was kind of defined by proxy wars like Vietnam.
Yeah, Lebanon was like a proxy war, really. But
Lebanon, all the Middle East, Vietnam,
Korea. It wouldn't even be that. And I'm not sure. I mean, I can sort of sympathise with some of the moves that are being made because what else can the US do really to exert pressure? And China's been given opportunities and hasn't, like you say, its markets aren't open to the West. It still manipulates currency. It's still, it's less democratic than it's arguably been since, the Cultural Revolution, I think. And it's wading into all sorts of territories. And
there's no rotating chairman anymore.
No, and it's become quite aggressive in a way that it wasn't even 4 or 5 years ago, actually. So I don't want the US to go and declare war on China, obviously, but I think trade sanctions and this kind of thing, I don't really see.
Why not just go all in then? Why not just go, right, that's it, you're cut off, China?
Well, I don't understand
anything
why they don't do
that. We don't want to know about it.
Maybe that's what's coming, but this is more. I mean, increasing this is when we just talk about telecom and bring it back to telecom. Why I think when we look at things like 6G and the future of technology, I think anybody who thinks that these future standards are going to be developed in the same way through a global kind of body where everybody meets and gets on and you have one system that works everywhere, I think it's starting to look quite naive, personally.
It is.
I think
the balkanization.
I think 6G will probably be a couple of standards. And
China can't not retaliate. I mean, if they're banning all these, then China's got to ban some US stuff. It's just going to keep happening. Yeah. The only interesting thing would be to see whether Biden, who was vice president under Obama, goes in a more Obama direction where he goes, "No, let's just take it easy. Let's all just."
I don't think
it's
just China and the US though either. Actually, I think that's the big one. But I think concern about other Russia perhaps, and and even to some extent, the UK's wrangling with the European Union at the moment. I think there's a desire on the part of a lot of countries and governments to be a lot more self-sufficient than they used to be, and more protectionist. And maybe in some ways it's not a bad thing. We talked about semiconductors a few times in the past, which is one that I find quite scary, that so many things are dependent these days on very high-end chips.
I saw something on
Tech
made by
Taiwan.
That Apple's having to scale back making MacBooks because it can't get hold of the chips.
Right. I mean, it's crazy that everything that with such a digital technological society economy these days, and we rely on this one big company in Taiwan that's in a country that China claims as its own. It's a dodgy situation to be in, and I think things like that need looking at and acting on, really. So
I completely agree. I was just butting in because I realised that A, we're running out of time, B, this segment was supposed to be about regulation, but I was so pleased with my segue that we spent enough time talking about that. So I'll touch on it briefly, and you just butt in if you've got anything to say on it. There are two stories about regulation that I wrote this week that I thought were of some interest. Earlier on the week, I've got a headline: US inches towards regulating social media platforms as utilities. Now, this isn't actually any announcement, but there's an American Supreme Court justice called Clarence Thomas. And basically, he was drawing a line under a thing where Trump got successfully sued for blocking people when he was on Twitter. And they argued that if Trump blocks them, that they're excluded from the public square, and that's out of order. And he drew a line under it, saying it doesn't. And then Trump appealed, and he went, it doesn't matter anymore because he's not president anymore, so all those considerations don't apply. But then he went, but while I'm on the subject, and then wrote this whole big essay on saying, well, if Trump can't ban people because it's a public square, then how can they ban Trump while he's still president if it's a public square? How can both be correct?
Yeah.
And he just got into that whole thing of, what is the status of social media? And I will always insist it is the public square, whether they like it or not. It annoys me when you get certain political opportunists going, they're a private company, they can do what they want, but it's only when they've banned people they don't like.
No, it's ridiculous. Big private companies are regulated for a reason, because they have monopolistic or oligopolistic power, and you see that in sectors ranging from telecom to oil to
exactly. And
to
in
banking.
terms of social media, there could be no doubting there's an oligopoly of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
It's even more pronounced because it's global. That's the trouble. But outside China and a few other countries, those platforms are used the world over. I mean, how many users has WhatsApp got at the moment? 2 billion, I think.
Yeah,
it's
like
it's clearly the public square, and clearly they need to be looked at and monitored. And it's no use people saying, oh, they can do what they want because they're a private company. I mean, that's like sort of accepting the most extreme version of free market economics there is.
Quite. It's basically saying we shouldn't have regulation.
Yeah, and big companies can do whatever they want. So it's a ridiculous argument.
It is. Yeah. I agree. And so he's basically, I won't get into the whole thing, but he's basically saying we should think about, it wasn't within the scope of his little tangent to do anything more than chuck it out there as an idea. But he said, we should seriously think about regulating them as utilities. It's just that they're information and public discussion utilities rather than telecoms or electricity or water. And I think he's got a point.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Okay, and then to finish off, the other regulatory thing was that the UK has launched something called the Digital Markets Unit, which basically seems to be a subset of the Competition and Markets Authority. So it's an anti-monopoly thing, such that I even cleverly used a photo of a Monopoly board on my story. And the DMU, as it's known to its mates, is going to focus just on the US digital giants, basically, and initially just Google and Facebook. So while I think their remit is intended to be broader than this, that their initial one is looking at a similar thing to what the Aussies have been agonizing over, which is basically that the whole of the traditional media has just been decimated in terms of revenues by Google and Facebook, because all the ad money. This is something that it's worth stressing again, that people forget. Media, the product with media isn't the content. The product is the audience. The content is a way of acquiring and maintaining an audience. And basically, as soon as there was a massive audience available on search engines, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, on social media, then, and furthermore, that these places knew a hell of a lot more about their users, so they're able to do a lot more targeted advertising than traditional media could. Pretty much all the advertising money just fled traditional media and went onto social media and the internet, which has meant, which is one reason why a lot of journalism is so shite these days. It's not just that journalists have become worse, it's just that there's much fewer of us. Obviously, when I say shut, I'm not referring to you and me, Ian. We're still
we're
exemplary among journalists. But, you take a typical, any newspaper, let's take the Telegraph, and I'm not picking them out as an example of good or bad, but, their total journalistic workforce will be a fraction of what it once was, and yet it has to produce even more content than ever because of digital. Whereas, 50 years ago, they just had to get a paper out every day.
Yeah, that's why everyone's spread so thinly.
So everyone's spread thinly. So you're going to get shitty journalism, even if you're a good journalist. If I had to write 5 stories a day, you're just sitting down, you go blah, 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 out the door. You're going to cut a lot of corners, and you're going to make mistakes. Anyway, so the Aussies have tried to sort this out by forcing Facebook and Google to pay media every time there is a link to a media story on them. And they've argued that, hold on a sec, those links benefit them. if someone puts up a link to a Telecoms.com store, I'm not going to make them pay me for it. I'm grateful for it. That's how the internet works.
Yeah.
I wish more people did. So it's a bit of a crude way of trying to redistribute money back from internet giants to traditional media. And it looks like that's what this DMU is going to try and do in the UK. And I sort of think, okay, it's interesting. Let's see how they go about it. Because I think if they try the Aussie approach, they'll probably get the same outcome, which is that Google will cave a bit, because I think their business model is more sensitive to this sort of thing. And Facebook's likely to go, do you know what? We just won't let people link to media on our site. And Facebook kind of called Australia's bluff. They ended up meeting in the middle, but Facebook ended up negotiating quite hard. So hopefully they'll learn from the Australian example and be a bit more subtle about it. And then the other thing I'm hoping that they pay attention to once they've got over this media thing is Amazon, both in terms of its effect on retail and its effect on the public cloud, because I think there are very real competition concerns there. They said
they're looking into that.
I'll leave the last word to you in terms of having a digital markets unit and a special regulator devoted to looking at the competition implications of the US tech giants. Does that seem like a good idea to you?
I think it sounds like a great idea. Yeah, I think it's we're out of the EU now, so we needed a kind of equivalent. I mean, they're quite active on this, aren't they? This front, the European Union seems to be one thing it does reasonably well.
They don't mind suing a US tech giant.
Yeah, I don't know how effective it's all been, but they've been quite sort of up for doing that. And those are massive concerns. I think some of the biggest concerns we face at the moment, and it's been made worse during the pandemic, is the dominance of the tech giants. And the one you mentioned, there's all the sort of news and free speech stuff, but the impact of Amazon, I think, on retail is enormous. It's such a big company and is in so many different sectors that I think it'd be a good idea to have a body that's just set up to look at things like that, for sure. I welcome it.
Yes. And just as a final thought, again, for people who get confused about the dichotomy between free market and controlled economy, Adam Smith, as I've said many times in this podcast, way back in the late 1700s, who's considered like the granddad of sort of free market economics, knew without a shadow of doubt you have to have strong regulation for the market to work. For a fully free market to work, it has to be regulated. It might seem counterintuitive, but the fact is, if you and I set up a company, if suddenly there was more money in telecoms podcasting than there is, and we were the dominant telecoms podcaster, we would, if we were allowed to, find ways of stopping any other people doing telecoms podcasts, either through M&A, through dirty tricks, through whatever, because it's in our interest to not have competition. We wouldn't let Phil do one, we wouldn't let Ray do one over at Telecom TV. We'd just find a way, wouldn't we? And so that's why you have to have, as someone who's small state, it pains me to say it, but that's why that's one area in which the state has to intervene, because private enterprise will take the piss if it gets half the chance. Cool. All right. Well, actually, we got quite a lot out of what was a fairly thin week for news. We're obviously getting a hang of just banging on. So I'll wrap it up there and just say thank you to you for coming in on what was sort of your day off.
No worries.
And thank you to the audience once more for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.